and I am very glad to say she joins us again now. Tara, before we return to your personal knowledge of Joe Biden, and I promise you we will, let me take you to that video that I showed at the beginning of the show, where Biden appears the most demented yet of many demented videos. His face falling like waxwork melting, his diction almost indecipherable, and his recollection of events confusing January the 6th with July the 6th, becoming such that if the 25th Amendment of the US Constitution is not under active consideration by his cabinet, then God help us all. What did you think of the latest Joe Biden?
Well, there's so many, but there you have it. He's not cognitively, obviously, present. They recently, I believe it was yesterday, he was in Mexico City and was talking about, he was being questioned about files that were discovered, Ukraine among them, that were actually classified in a locked closet of a think tank. Now, CNN is doing their spin and trying to softball it, but he became very confused about these files and couldn't answer the question and said he has a lot of classified files. Well, in the US law, you're not a representative of the government is not supposed to have classified documents off-site or without clearance and that kind of thing. And at the time, he was the vice president, so he shouldn't have had them at all. But one of those files is on Ukraine, interestingly enough, around 2014. So there you have it. I mean,
I was going to ask you about these files, Tara, because here we have, there was a gigantic hue and cry and an FBI raid on the private residence of the former President Trump over his alleged possession of documents that should never have been taken out of the White House. And now we have the head of the government that ordered that raid on Mar-a-Lago, caught in his think tank with documents not only that shouldn't have been brought out of the White House, but which he, as the then vice president, should not even have been in possession of at all.
Exactly. And the way that the corporate US media is handling it, or the Western media, is really what's significant here, George. I mean, they're trying to spin it as not a big deal. They made a huge deal out of Donald Trump, and members of the Democratic Party were calling for all kinds of punishments for Donald Trump. And now that it's Joe Biden, there's a lot of backpedaling and, of course, hypocrisy. But what's really notable about all of this is the weaponization of the intelligence community, the DOJ, the CIA, the FBI, and the collusion with social media and media to shape the narrative. And so that's one example of how they're trying to shape a narrative or suppress a story, spin it out the way they want, instead of just presenting the facts and letting people know the information. So we are definitely in an information war because they are trying to push the proxy war against Russia via Ukraine. And the
No, poczekaj. No, poczekaj. No, poczekaj. Zajac!
Ja se nie bojím. Nezľaknem sa vlkačisovi, ja sa nebojím.
Harvesting information, right, about users, consumers of these social media platforms, but they're censoring them and also making sure that their political candidate, in this case, it was Joe Biden's campaign and the Democrats, were amplified and Republicans, for instance, were suppressed. That's very dangerous indeed. That's shaping elections. That's changing the course of the history of the world. And now here we are. And I got into a lot of trouble, as you know, George Galloway, in 2020, when I said, if Joe Biden becomes president, he will try to take us toward a Russia. And here we are. We're almost at World War III. I mean, I think it was last week, they've put orders down that now Ukrainian soldiers are going to be trained in the United States at military sites, trained to use weapons and sent back. So, I mean, they're saying that it's a proxy war, right? But I think we were approaching now a hot war, and we're even closer to World War III. But the voices that of citizens, American, European, that are trying to say, we don't want war, we don't want this, we're being silenced and censored all over.
Well, Jack was either lying to Congress or things were happening in his company that he didn't know about. That is, of course, possible, though doesn't reflect well on him. But the new ownership of Twitter has opened at least some of these sinister cabinets and revealed all kinds of horrific things, some of which you've referred to. Tell us what happened this week, because I saw your name come up. What did you discover about what they had been doing to you?
Well, apparently Twitter, I knew about this a little because a Twitter attorney from Perkins Coie had reached out to me and said, I made a motion in court because it was a sealed document that my communications, everything had been taken under sealed warrants. And he said, assume this isn't just Twitter, this is everything, email, everything. And I said, okay. And, but there wasn't much to do. You can try to quash, but when you're up against the DOJ, you can't. They impaneled a grand jury. And to this day, I don't know why it's sealed. My attorney tried to find out. Investigative reporters have tried to find out. It is simply pending. So it's been pending. So apparently, according to a reporter, one of the reasons that the Biden campaign wanted the DOJ to surveil me was they wanted to find out what journalists were covering my story. So that's one theory. I don't know if that's fact. That was the theory that was presented.
Whatever happened to the Me Too mantra that women must be believed? You are a living, breathing example of a woman that was not only not believed, but whose allegations were actively suppressed, therefore.
Yeah, you know, when it happened, when I worked for Joe Biden, I went through protocol. I didn't go public. And I was very quiet about it, as you know, because we've had this conversation for a long, long time. I went through the proper protocols, but it was never properly investigated ever. So when I came forward in 2019 is when 8 other women came forward. As you mentioned, I thought the Me Too movement would be there for me. Wow, it wasn't. It's there for anyone accusing a Republican in the United States. But if you're accusing a neoliberal, they seem to go for the hills, right? And I think the only reason that Cuomo was brought to heel was because of the nursing home scandal and because there was a criminal investigation that resulted in him being able to be thrown under the bus. They were done with Cuomo. With Biden, you know, he's still being propped up. And, you know, you mentioned at the top of our discussion here about his possible dementia. I don't know, I'm not a medical doctor, but his cognitive abilities obviously are quite questioned by a lot of people. But it's the people around him that are dangerous, you know, and it's particularly when we're this close to possible World War III, when they're talking about limited nuclear war, and they're actually having conversations. Like, I keep hoping that there are people that I knew years ago that are back behind the scenes working for peace, but there aren't. If you look at who makes up some of those jobs, it's a very, a group of people that are very enriched. So I call them, you know, the predator class, the predator elite class, right? They're lining their pockets right now. They'll take the war to just so much of a brink and then try to pull back. But, you know, we're learning a lot, George. Like, you know, for instance, we've learned that there was a memo, right, saying that NATO wasn't going to expand. That got released in FOIA, in Freedom of Information Act. There was an agreement with Gorbachev back with the Soviet Union that the NATO was not going to expand its borders. And for the last 2 decades, it has. It's expanded to the point where it's presented an existential threat to Russia. Of course, they're protecting their borders. And as you mentioned, they're protecting the 14,000 people that were murdered. They're protecting their families and other people and Russian nationals there in the Donbass region. And, you know, But in our media, in the Western media, they're denying that there's Nazis in Ukraine. There's denying that there's a kill website, a Ukrainian kill site, which has 337 children on it. I've spoken to one of them, Faina, who is on a kill site where 12 journalists have been killed. And once someone's killed, they put liquidated. They dox these people. They have journalists. I think Roger Waters is on that website, and I've been told some others. So, but Western media won't cover it. So again, we're just being lied to as citizens. And, I actually shared, it's so interesting, George, I shared your speech that you gave in Congress today. I shared it when you were talking about Iraq, because that was such a powerful speech that you gave when you called out the senators in the US back then about them lying about weapons of mass destruction and all that. And here we are, we're reliving those lies again, all to benefit the military.
Indeed so, indeed we are. And Henry Kissinger's outfit this day released now indisputable evidence that the United States did promise Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch east of Germany.
That's what I was referring to. Yeah.
This, of course, was a verbal promise. Gorbachev was too flattered and stupid to get it in copper-bottomed writing, but it was a clear promise nonetheless, as Kissinger has made clear this day.
Yeah. And there's been plenty of memos and discussions about this. I mean, the fact that NATO should have been dissolved. I mean, it should be dissolved. There's no reason. But there you have it. We have NATO, and it's become this arm of the U.S. military-industrial complex, and it's just generating income for the people that benefit from that, sadly. And the people that suffer are civilians and your working class people everywhere.
Civilians and the poor bloody infantry being killed in Bakhmut and in Solidar at this very hour. Last question. It's a difficult one, Tara. If you don't want to answer it, feel free to decline. But you told us in 2019 that Joe Biden was not a fit and proper person to be the president of the United States because of your own personal experience with him. When do you think this cognitive decline that is evident now to everyone, when do you think that set in?
It's hard to say. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, actually, a lot of people noticed it on the campaign trail. They kept him it was COVID, so there was the joke about him being in the basement, but there was a reason why they didn't have him out and about very much, because he had a tendency to be, to not have very good filters. So I think the first sign was just the filters being dropped. But of course, at the time that I knew him, he was at the height of his senatorial power. He was younger and he was quite fit. So there were no he wasn't the most brilliant guy. He was known to be, kind of and you were in politics long enough, you probably heard, he wasn't an intellectual giant at all. He wasn't like a learned politician. He was more, in it for the glory of it, I guess, if you will. But the signs really showed even on the campaign trail. You'd see him lose his temper, things like that with constituents. It was there. People the Biden campaign machine was just in operation, and they kept it going.